BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Friday, another Cooper Friday. Welcome to the show. On Fridays this year, I've been talking to you guys all about D.B. Cooper, the man responsible for the only unsolved skyjacking in U.S. aviation history. D.B. Cooper is the name that was given to the person who committed the skyjacking. He actually checked into the flight under the name Dan Cooper, which almost all parties believe was an alias. And the media mistakenly reported him as D.B. Cooper, although there are a few interconnecting steps in that journey. But in this episode, I'm going to be talking all about Ted B. Braden as a D.B. Cooper suspect. He is the suspect of Drew Beeson, who is the author of the book Paratrooper of Fortune. And in one of my earliest interviews, I had the opportunity to discuss this with Drew Beeson, one of the earliest interviews for BlackBoxOnlineRadio, that is. And Drew Beeson also posts regular content out on his own YouTube channel and uses the same name over there, Drew Beeson. And recently, he put out a live stream called the Coopercast, where he interviewed an individual named Mike Davis, and they were talking all about Ted Braden as a D.B. Cooper suspect. And I want to look at a combination of these different observations that people have made about Ted B. Braden. And there are also some challenge questions that we're going to be exploring in this episode, such as, was D.B. Cooper in the military? Was he ex-military? Was he someone with a high amount of parachuting experience? Or was he an inexperienced skydiver? Because when you look into the D.B. Cooper case, you'll find that there are suspects all across the spectrum, and a lot of the mainstream sources out there tend to share information that they don't think that D.B. Cooper was a regular skydiver or had a lot of experience. And then there are people like Drew Beeson, author of Paratrooper of Fortune, who state that he thinks that D.B. Cooper was one of the best skydivers in the entire world, that being Ted B. Braden. And Ted B. Braden was indeed an excellent skydiver, and he was a master parachutist. He even represented the United States military, the U.S. Army, in skydiving competitions. And I'm going to provide the most basic introduction here, and I'm actually going to go over to Ted Braden's Wikipedia page. And some people might not want to hear that, but John Lorden of the Lorden Arts True Crime channel recommends doing that for basic introductions because he finds that it really does provide the biggest nutshell version. But there's a specific reason why I wanted to read this off here on Cooper Friday, and that's because there is a section on Ted Braden's D.B. Cooper page that I thought really encapsulated some of the reasons why people think that he could have been D.B. Cooper. Ted Braden was born Theodore Burdett Braden, Jr. He was a Special Forces commando during the Vietnam War, master skydiver, and suspect in the D.B. Cooper hijacking. In terms of his military career, he was born in Ohio. Ted Braden joined the military at the age of 16 and in 1944 served with the 101st Airborne during World War II and would stay in the Army until 1949, rising to the rank of second lieutenant. In 1954, Ted Braden joined the Air Force with the intention of becoming a pilot, but he resigned that same year during the pre-flight training. He re-enlisted in the Army in 1958 and became part of the Army Sport Parachute Club, which was known as the Golden Arrows at the time, but later known as the Golden Knights. All right, so already we see that there are some very big points that could indicate how Ted Braden just developed more and more parachuting experience over the years. And when I first talked to Drew Beeson about his suspect, Ted Braden, being D.B. Cooper, he described him as somebody who had a death wish partnered with the iron will to live. And even if you get on the D.B. Cooper suspect's WordPress, they're also going to say some similar things about how and why that's actually a point for Ted Braden to be D.B. Cooper, because D.B. Cooper would have had to have been rather fearless to jump out at night into cloud cover, into inclement weather, wearing only a suit, wearing loafers, no helmet, not a lot of safety gear. And this is the stuff that they were discussing on that recent live stream that's available on Drew Beeson's channel with Staff Sergeant Mike Davis, when they were just saying that this is what Ted Braden was known for, taking risks, not having a very high regard for the safety of well, his own well-being, someone who would approach these things in a fearless way, someone who would not be nerved by the conditions. Because some people, like in the more mainstream sources, again, like the documentaries that you'll watch on the History Channel and Nat Geo, they are just sort of predicting that D.B. Cooper was inexperienced. Looking at it from the perspective of D.B. Cooper did not have a lot of parachuting experience because he took risks that maybe an experienced parachutist would not have done. And this is ultimately why a lot of the theories that are put forward, again, on the History Channel and Nat Geo, talk about how they don't believe that D.B. Cooper could have survived the skyjacking and the parachuting because one of the big challenges is that D.B. Cooper would have been jumping out at night. And this is, again, addressed by Drew Beast on the most recent live stream when they're saying that the only people that would really consider a jump like that would be someone who was in the military or ex-military. And a lot of the D.B. Cooper suspects that are discussed are ex-military. A lot of them are World War II veterans. And that isn't too hard to narrow down. But when you have a suspect like Milton Vordahl, whom I was discussing last week on Cooper Friday, he was one who just didn't really seem to have a lot of parachuting experience. And they're talking about how when you watch skydiving on television or you watch a lot of recordings of it, it's very frequently done in the daytime. Most recreational skydiving is done in the daytime. Most people who have skydiving experience and parachuting experience will have done it during the daytime, during the daylight hours, whereas D.B. Cooper would have been jumping at night. And that really does seem to indicate that he had a military background and he had, at the very least, some understanding of parachuting at night, because that would be an extremely risky thing to do if he was not familiar with that type of condition. And at the very least, not I talk about this every Friday, though, the big challenge of jumping not only at night but also into the cold would be another one, losing awareness of what he was doing, like his surroundings, equilibrium, not knowing up from down. And the very simple answer is if D.B. Cooper did not survive the jump, then, well, what happened to the body? What happened to the rest of the money that was not recovered, other than the 3 stacks of bills from Tina Barr? And of course, where did the parachute go? And so a lot of people would look at that as evidence that D.B. Cooper did indeed survive the entire skyjacking ordeal. So really, I would just want to ask you guys the challenge question once again. Do you believe that D.B. Cooper was ex-military or not? Do you believe that he was an experienced parachutist or not? I know those are 2 different challenge questions, but I would like to just turn that over to you guys. And I would like to continue with the discussion on Ted Braden, because there are some very different things about him compared to the other D.B. Cooper suspects. And as I said, a lot of them have military backgrounds, but perhaps they weren't as much of an elite as Ted Braden was. And I'm going to read the D.B. Cooper suspects section right here. Despite his ability as a soldier, he was not well liked personally and was described by a family member as the perfect combination of high intelligence and criminality. He was believed by many within the Special Forces community, both at the time of the D.B. Cooper hijacking and in subsequent years, to have been D.B. Cooper. From his time working with covert operations in Vietnam, he would have likely possessed the then classified knowledge about the ability and proper specifications for jumping from a 727, perhaps having done it himself on a Mac-Misog mission. Physically, Braden's military records list him as 5 feet 8 inches tall, which is shorter than the height description of at least 5 feet 10 inches tall given by the 2 flight attendants, but this military measurement would have been taken in his stocking feet and he would have appeared taller in shoes. However, he possessed a dark complexion from years of outdoor military service. He had short dark hair, a medium athletic build, and was 43 years old at the time of the hijacking, which are all features that are in line with the descriptions of D.B. Cooper. Okay, though, I mean, we can talk about the physical descriptions in a second, but I wanted to look at this thing a little bit more here, talking about how a lot of people in the Special Forces community thought that, hey, wait a second, this guy could have been D.B. Cooper. They're thinking that someone who, again, is representing the Army in skydiving competitions, in international skydiving events, because he's extremely good at it. You heard that stuff about the Golden Arrows and the Golden Knights. Somebody who has the perfect combination of high intelligence and criminal behavior and criminality Well, all of that stuff is coming together in the DB Cooper persona, because one of the reasons why people are attracted to the DB Cooper story is because DB Cooper was not an ordinary criminal. He didn't murder anyone. He wasn't a serial killer. He wasn't someone who is actually following through with his threat to use the bomb, even though he did carry what he called a bomb. He said that he had a bomb on the plane and he showed it to the staff, but he didn't murder anyone with it. So DB Cooper is someone who definitely seemed like he was more doing this either for the thrill, or there could be a secondary and alternative motive. And I would like to look at a section here for that, saying, in December of 1966, Ted Braden deserted his unit in Vietnam and made his way to the Congo to serve as a mercenary, but only served there for a short time before being arrested by CIA agents and taken back to the United States for a court-martial. Despite having committed a capital offense by deserting in wartime, Ted Braden was given an honorable discharge and barred from re-enlisting in the military in exchange for his continued secrecy about the MACV-SOG program. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'm going to share something in a second that is going to be not exactly a statement of belief, but rather it's just a question that I'm curious about. I'll share that with you guys in a second, but at this time I would like to ask, are there any other DB Cooper suspects that you would like to hear about on Cooper Friday? Or are there any other aspects of the DB Cooper mystery that you would like to hear about? If so, you can put your ideas in the comment section down below. You can also hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. And if you want to support all of these efforts on Black Box Online Radio, talking about the Zodiac Killer, Jack the Ripper, and DB Cooper, you can go over to BuyMeACoffee.com, BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNid88, and make a donation or contribution to help support the show. And anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And the thing that I wanted to ask you guys was that, does it not seem weird to you that the DB Cooper mystery was not solved? Does it not seem like this is a case that should have been solved? It's not something like the previously mentioned Zodiac Killer and Jack the Ripper, where there really isn't as much evidence as you would expect, and a lot of the hard evidence has either been damaged or destroyed over the years. With DB Cooper, I mean, people spend hours with this guy. He's touching all types of things on the plane. He is leaving behind fingerprints. He left behind his own tie that he was wearing. I mean, there should be all types of physical evidence, let alone, if they have found money at Tina Bar, 3 stacks of bills, if they can get all of this evidence together. Doesn't it seem weird to you that this case has not been solved? Now, this is the question that I wanted to truly ask, and that is, do you think that's because DB Cooper was Ted B. Braden, somebody who, again, has this type of military background, someone who was barred from re-enlisting in the military in exchange for his continued secrecy about the Special Forces programs and special units that he worked with, somebody whom they would cover things up for, meaning that, yeah, the authorities know who DB Cooper was. They're just leaving the case open-ended because they are, well, again, it's a cover-up, and you could call that a conspiracy theory if you want. I mean, that's mostly a conspiracy question, if you ask me. I don't know if that's true or not, but somebody like Ted Braden seems like the type of person that the authorities would cover for, because then that might open a can of worms, having journalists and investigators prying into secrets about special forces and special units and activities in Vietnam and mercenaries and the Congo and all of these other things. Somebody whom they would have wanted to have kept under wraps. It's just something that I'm curious about. Now let's go back to some other observations about Ted Braden. He's 5 feet 8 inches tall. I mean, I guess that could pass for 5'10" if he's wearing shoes. Possibly. But who's to say that DB Cooper actually was 5 feet 10 inches tall? I mean, most of the time he was sitting down on the plane, and also he is also going to just not really give out his height or anything like that. These are all done with estimations. Now, being dark in complexion from years of outdoor military service, absolutely that's a strong point. Absolutely that's a strong point, because DB Cooper was described as having somewhat of an olive complexion, but when you look at the composite sketches of DB Cooper, he definitely appears to be a Caucasian male of European descent. So some people, I mean, I can think of at least one person whom I won't mention, was pushing a theory involving about how DB Cooper was actually a Latino, and maybe I'll do a future episode on that one, but probably not. And then there's also one thing here, though, about Ted Braden is 43 years old, was 43 years old at the time, and they estimate that DB Cooper was around 43 or 44. When I did the episode on Sheridan Peterson as a DB Cooper suspect, Sheridan Peterson openly said that he was 44 years old at the time, which they believe DB Cooper to be, or to have been. And I think that that again seems to be much more appropriate, because even though I was just talking to you guys about Milton Vordahl as a DB Cooper suspect, then, I mean, he was 58 years old at the time of the skyjacking. And when you look at the composite sketches of DB Cooper, he does not appear to have been 58 years old. When you look at that, it looks like a guy in his early 40s. That's just my personal take on the subject. Now let's get to some of the most widely discussed counter-arguments about Ted Braden as a DB Cooper suspect. One of them is, some people think that he doesn't resemble the sketches. And I've stated on multiple Cooper Fridays that I believe that the sketches are reasonably accurate, because if you're going to spend hours with somebody, even if it's just kind of walking back and forth, like if someone is sitting in a seat and you're walking back and forth and just looking at them a little bit every couple of minutes over a period of several hours, you're probably going to remember a lot about their features. That being said, there are multiple composites of DB Cooper, and I don't think that any of the two composites look exactly the same. But there are elements of Ted Braden's physical appearance that are found in a lot of them, and one thing that has been shared is that there is something that is known as Composite C, or it's also referred to as the Florence Schaffner sketch. The flight attendants that interacted with DB Cooper the most were Florence Schaffner and Tina Mucklow, and one of them, Florence Schaffner, provided a lot of details to a sketch artist who created the C composite. And the reason why this one gets discussed with Ted Braden is it wants to show that he had a rather similar hairline to that particular sketch. And Drew Beeson also shared some things with me prior to this episode, which I asked him to do, and he has shared several other images to show that Ted Braden did indeed resemble the other composite sketches, as well as some photos of him, again from certain angles and certain lights, showing that he does look like the composites, whereas there's a very famous photo of Ted Braden out there that's almost done at somewhat of an upward angle, as if the camera were slightly below him and facing upward. And in that one, I don't think he resembles the DB Cooper sketches, because yes, I'm going to address this issue. Ted Braden has a very large nose in that photo, and you will just hear people talking about that. Even when I interviewed Jeremy Berthium talking about his DB Cooper suspect, Kenny Christensen, many people have Kenny Christensen as a DB Cooper suspect, then he is talking about how Ted Braden has a very large nose, and that doesn't seem to be mentioned in any of the DB Cooper descriptions. And I have also said that when you look at one of the composites, DB Cooper has an extremely narrow nose at one point, right near the bridge, like it's almost unnaturally narrow. So I think that perhaps that is an incorrect detail, or that could be the way he looked like. I could go either way on that one, but that's just something that I wanted to point out, that it's just almost unnaturally narrow. There are multiple composites though, and some of them do resemble Ted B. Braden, and they all have features that resemble Ted B. Braden. And in terms of being a master parachutist, Ted Braden could have done this alone. He wouldn't have needed accomplices. Now, I just mentioned Kenny Christensen as a DB Cooper suspect, and again, I've interviewed Jeremy Berthium, and he has shared all of the reasons why he thought Kenny Christensen was DB Cooper. I also have a couple Zodiac interviews with Jeremy, and with Kenny Christensen, I think everybody might agree with this. He would have had an accomplice. There are just too many people that are connected to the story. Even if it's physically possible for Joe Schmo to jump out of an airplane with a parachute and the money wrapped around him, yes, a single person can do that. But if that Joe Schmo were Kenny Christensen, he would have had an accomplice, because there are just too many stories that involve a second person. And by accomplice, I also mean someone who was just covering things up. Whereas a lot of the other DB Cooper suspects that I've been talking to you about on Cooper Friday are rather different. They wouldn't necessarily require accomplices like Joe Lackage, William J. Smith, Milton Vordahl. This would be more or less something that was done on their own. And with Ted Braden, I don't necessarily see the reason or need why he would have had an accomplice. And interestingly, though, on that episode of Drew Beeson's channel, The Cooper live stream that he did recently with Staff Sergeant Mike Davis, they were talking about how another thing that somebody who was ex-military might have had the awareness of is that when he's jumping out into cloud cover, into the rain, this would actually be a benefit to someone because it would have destroyed a lot of the evidence, like footprints or just the exact landing zone, and it would be very difficult to track somebody in the rain. This is why they're talking about how this is just exactly how a military parachutist would be thinking about something like this. He would have had these types of awareness things. A lot of planning would have gone into this, and also the biggest amounts of planning would have gone into what would happen after the jump was completed, after the skydiver touched down, no matter whom he was. If he were indeed somebody who was ex-military and a very seasoned military individual, perhaps on par with Ted Braden, he would have planned out 96 hours after he landed. I mean, we're talking about things like destroying evidence. We're talking about things like the exit strategies, not being seen, not being noticed, all of that. That would have all been planned out. And in terms of being a skilled parachutist, one of the biggest reasons why people believe that D.B. Cooper did not survive the skyjacking was because that it was an extremely dangerous jump. But Ted Braden was someone who was very skilled at halo jumping, high altitude, low opening, halo jumping. So he wouldn't necessarily have been afraid to jump into cloud cover at that feet. I mean, like at 10,000 feet, because he would, again, he's good at high altitude, low opening of the parachute, and he would have been able to navigate the area. And one thing that Drew Beeson did share with me as well is that another reason why people believe that D.B. Cooper didn't survive the jump was because the parachute that D.B. Cooper was using was not one that could be steered or manually maneuvered to a desired location. But what Drew Beeson said is that that's just kind of a common misbelief that Ted Braden had actually trained with that parachute and knew how to maneuver that specific parachute because he had practiced with it on emergency rigs. So again, this guy has all the knowledge to commit the D.B. Cooper skyjacking, criminal mentality, high intelligence, nerves of steel, isn't going to be afraid at all. But that just begs the question of, well, what happened to the money? Was he confronted by the FBI and then did they just put a lid on it because they didn't want their secrets getting out? And this is the point where I'm going to turn it over to you guys and just ask you, what do you think about Ted Braden as a D.B. Cooper suspect? If you can't tell from this episode, I think he's a pretty strong one. And I really wanted to share a lot of my own observations in this one as opposed to just pulling from other sources after the basic introduction and some things from Drew Beeson and Mike Davis, but really just to look at my own observations, and that is that I don't accept this result that, D.B. Cooper would not have been an excellent parachutist because of the way that he conducted himself on the plane. I mean, I don't think that rules anything out. And you might have noticed on Cooper Friday, I'm 50-50 on a lot of things because so many points that are discussed are just interpretive. They're just possibilities. And I think that D.B. Cooper, now here's a big one. I think that D.B. Cooper had a very intense and high understanding of aviation. I've said that very clearly, which Ted Braden would have. And according to the basic info, he would have even had awareness of things about the Boeing 727 aircrafts, which might not have even been common knowledge at the time. Sure, but some guy who's ex-Army, ex-Air Force, and a world-class paratrooper, of course he's going to know a lot about aviation. But I'm going to have to do a larger episode for you guys talking all about how I think something fishy is going on with the investigations. Now, it could be that the investigation was just bungled and mishandled and that things weren't done right and that's why the evidence was lost and destroyed and that there actually were a lot more fines that could have taken place than the authorities just didn't do a good job. That could have happened. Or it could also be something much more conspiratorial. And there are several different ways to explore that. And I mean, I can provide a little bit of an introduction right now, and that is some people think that the whole thing was a setup and that it was all done for testing aviation security and It was also things about putting in somewhat of a false flag system. Not really false flag, but I mean, I just can't think of a better way of putting it. Putting a guy on a plane with a bomb and then giving the general public a reason to be afraid of the skies so that they could institute more security measures. That's what I meant by false flag, but I shouldn't have used that term. And I mean, these types of conspiracy theories just sound ridiculous when you hear them at first, but once you go down the rabbit hole, things start to make a little bit more sense. And I didn't start out as a conspiracy theorist, but I am one now. I heard that on Joe Rogan once, and I borrowed it because, yes, I mean, this seems like a case that should have been solved, and I really begin to wonder if there is some type of cover up. Now, Ted Braden would fit in very nicely with that, whereas other suspects perhaps would not, such as Kenny Christensen, Milton Vordal, and maybe even Joe Lackich, the ones that I've been discussing. But I wanted to start out this Cooper Friday series talking about suspects whom I think are credible or they have a high chance of actually being DB Cooper. And I would love to know your feedback, as well as feel free to go through some of the other episodes here on Cooper Friday. I have standalone episodes on the previously mentioned suspects, Joe Lackich, Kenny Christensen, Milton Vordal, and William J. Smith. That's another one. So please feel free to give those a listen please feel free to give those a listen, and I will talk to you guys next week on Cooper Friday, and I'll see you on Monday talking about the Zodiac Killer. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box, and there was always BlackBoxNed88 over on Instagram. I'll see you over there. Until next time.